At 11:55 p.m. on December 11th, 1944, 5 Japanese ships were already moving toward the beach at Ormoc Bay. They were not racing, they were not zigzagging, they were confident. They had done this before. 9 major convoys had already forced their way in. More than 34,000 Japanese soldiers had reached Leyte through this water. Tonight was supposed to be routine. Another landing, another reinforcement, another delay to the American advance. Nothing about this night looked unusual from the deck of those ships, and that was the mistake. Because less than 20 minutes later, all 5 of those vessels would be destroyed. Not damaged, not driven off. Destroyed. Sunk or shattered beyond use. And the weapon that did it was not a battleship, not a cruiser, not aircraft, not even coastal artillery. It was an American tank destroyer, actually 3 of them, firing a total of 15 rounds in 18 minutes, with 0 American casualties. That sentence alone should feel wrong. A tank destroyer is not a naval weapon. An infantry division does not fight a navy. That is not how modern war works. Or at least that is what every field manual in 1944 said. And that is exactly why the War Department would later question whether this had really happened at all. Here is the claim that landed on a desk in Washington weeks later, stripped of drama. Stripped of context, reduced to numbers on a report. 15 rounds fired, 5 enemy vessels sunk, engagement duration 18 minutes, friendly casualties 0, enemy casualties estimated at 750, location Ormoc Bay, Leyte, Philippines, reporting unit 77th Infantry Division, United States Army. To anyone who understood how war was supposed to work, this sounded like an error, or exaggeration, or myth-making under fire. Tanks did not sink ships. They never had. Not in Europe, not in the Pacific, not anywhere. I remember the first time I read those numbers. My reaction was simple. Someone counted wrong. Because if this were true, it would not just be unusual. It would be unique. At that moment in the war, the United States Navy dominated the sea around Leyte. Destroyers patrolled offshore. Aircraft roamed the skies. PT boats hunted at night. If Japanese ships were stopped, that was supposed to be the Navy's job. Infantry divisions were there to fight soldiers, dig foxholes, take hills. They were not supposed to be looking out over black water at midnight calculating range and deflection on moving ships. But Ormoc Bay was not a normal place anymore. By early December 1944, it had become a funnel, the last open door for Japanese reinforcements on the western side of Leyte. Every night that door stayed open meant more Japanese troops in the mountains, more resistance, more American dead. And everyone on the island understood that if Ormoc was not sealed, the campaign would drag on for weeks, maybe months. The Japanese understood this too. That is why those ships were coming in despite heavy losses. That is why they kept trying even after destroyers were sunk and convoys shattered. Retreat was not an acceptable option. Orders were orders. Troops had to land. What the Japanese did not expect, what no one expected, was that the men waiting for them on shore were not thinking like infantry. They were thinking like accountants, like engineers, like artillerymen. They were thinking in angles, distances, penetration values. They were the oldest infantry division in the United States armies. Average age 32, a unit other divisions jokingly called the old bastards. And they had already proven one thing across the Pacific. They did not care what the manual said if the math worked. This is where the story turns, because when those 5 ships crossed into the killing zone, nobody on the American side was improvising wildly or panicking or guessing. Orders had already gone out. Track the vessels, wait for illumination, fire on command. That alone should raise your eyebrows. Infantry divisions do not issue fire plans against ships, yet here it was, written down, timed, rehearsed. At exactly 12 a.m. the first illumination round went up. The bay lit white, and suddenly theory met reality. I want to pause here for a moment because this is the point where most people mentally check out and say that sounds cinematic, but real war is messier than that. That reaction is normal. I had it too. But the documents do not blink. The timestamps line up. The wrecks were later measured. Steel does not lie. In the next 18 minutes, a sequence unfolded that would quietly force the US Army to rewrite its understanding of what its weapons could do. No speeches, no heroics, just physics discipline and an understanding that a ship with thin hull plating does not care whether the hole flooding it came from a naval gun or a tank gun. By the time the last flare burned out, Ormoc Bay was full of wreckage burning fuel and bodies in the water, and the 77th Infantry Division went back to preparing for the next day's fighting, treating, what had just happened as routine defense. The War Department would not see it that way, neither should you. Because what happened next is not just about what was destroyed that night, but about why it mattered far beyond Ormoc, far beyond Leyte, and far beyond those 18 minutes. Ormoc Bay did not look important on most maps. A shallow curve on the western side of Leyte. No famous beaches, no dramatic cliffs. But by December of 1944, it had become the most dangerous piece of water in the Philippines, because it was the last place the Japanese could still move men in bulk. Every other route had been cut. American aircraft ruled the sky by day. Destroyers and cruisers hunted at night. The eastern ports were gone. The roads through the mountains were death traps. That left Ormoc, one bay, one narrow approach, one chance to keep the ground war alive. From late October through December 11th, the Imperial Japanese Army attempted 9 major reinforcement runs into Leyte. Not small patrols, not single barges, organised convoys. In total, roughly 34,000 troops were pushed through Ormoc Bay despite constant losses. Along the way, the Japanese lost at least 20 transport vessels, 6 destroyers, 1 submarine, 3 escort ships, and a patrol boat. The Americans lost ships too. 3 destroyers, 1 high-speed transport, 2 landing ships medium. This was not a quiet backwater. Naval historians would later call Ormoc Bay one of the most brutal sustained interdiction battles of the Pacific War. And yet the Japanese kept coming. Because they had to. General Tomoyuki Yamashita had committed to making Leyte decisive. If Leyte held, the Philippines might still be contested. If Leyte fell cleanly, the road to Luzon opened wide. Yamashita did the math. Without reinforcements, the Japanese 35th Army on Leyte would be starved of ammunition, food and replacements. With reinforcements, even late and costly ones, they could keep fighting. So Ormoc Bay stayed open by force of will alone. This is the part people often miss. The Japanese were not ignorant of the losses. They were not blind. They were making a calculated decision that losing ships was acceptable if troops got ashore, even if only half survived, even if most died later in the mountains. Delay was victory. Every extra week on Leyte meant more American casualties elsewhere. That logic is ugly, but it is consistent, and it explains why 5 ships were willing to approach that bay at night, even after months of carnage. I'll be honest here. When you look at those numbers, the Japanese losses, the American losses, the relentless repetition, it stops feeling like strategy and starts feeling like momentum dragging everyone forward. Once Ormoc became the funnel, no one could step out of it. Not the sailors, not the soldiers, not the commanders. On land, the situation was just as tight. The 77th Infantry Division had landed south of Ormoc on December the 7th. They were not expected there. Japanese planners assumed the Americans would grind through the mountains. Instead, the division pushed 23 miles in 72 hours, smashed through prepared positions, crossed rivers under fire, and took Ormoc town by December the 10th. The place was rubble. Camp Downs was ash. The Antillo River ran red for days, but capturing the town did not stop the reinforcements. Ships kept coming at night, unloading troops directly onto beaches still covered by Japanese defensive fire. This created a problem no field manual solved. The Navy could not be everywhere in shallow water. PT boats were effective but limited. Aircraft could not see through darkness without illumination, and infantry divisions were not equipped to fight ships. On paper, this should have meant stalemate. In reality, it meant adaptation or failure. I find this moment fascinating because this is where doctrine quietly breaks. Not in a dramatic argument, not in a shouted order. It breaks because reality refuses to cooperate. The 77th did not receive new weapons. They did not receive new training. They used what they had. M10 tank destroyers positioned for direct fire support. Mortars capable of firing illumination. Anti-aircraft guns that did not care what they were pointed at. Machine guns with clear fields of fire and, most importantly, time to think. Ormoc Bay forced a simple question. If a ship reaches the beach, it unloads men. If it unloads men, Americans die later. So the ship cannot be allowed to reach the beach. It does not matter who sinks it. It does not matter what the manual says. It only matters that it stops moving troops. That logic turned Ormoc into something new. Not a harbour, not a bay, a trap. By the night of December 11th, the Japanese were still treating Ormoc as a viable entry point. The Americans were not. They were treating it as a controlled killing zone layered with overlapping fire-timed illumination and weapons never meant for naval combat. The bay was narrow enough that ships had to commit. Once committed, they could not maneuver freely. Shallow water limited speed. Dark hills blocked escape routes. Every advantage favoured the defenders on shore if they were willing to pull the trigger. What happened next would prove that they were. The 77th Infantry Division was never supposed to be exceptional. On paper, it was the opposite. Reactivated in March of 1942, filled mostly with men from New York and New Jersey, many of them reservists, many of them drafted late, many of them already past the age where the army liked to see infantrymen. Their average age hovered around 32, in an army where 19 and 20-year-olds were the norm that mattered. Other divisions noticed. They joked about it. Quietly at first, then openly. The nickname stuck. The old bastards. What rarely gets said is that the men themselves accepted it. They did not try to outrun younger units. They did not compete on aggressiveness. They did not romanticize bayonet charges or reckless advances. They had lived too much life for that. Taxi drivers, accountants, factory workers, men who had raised families, paid rent, survived the Depression. They understood cost. They understood waste. And when they learned war, they learned it the same way, as a problem to be solved efficiently. The division's numbers tell the story better than any speech ever could. Across the entire Pacific War, American forces killed approximately 2,200,000 Japanese soldiers and captured about 50,000. That works out to a capture rate of roughly 2.2%. The 77th Infantry Division captured 358 prisoners while killing more than 43,000 enemy soldiers, a capture rate of 0.8%. One-third the rate of every other American unit in the Pacific. On Leyte alone, in 6 weeks of fighting, they killed 19,456 Japanese troops and captured 124. Those are not numbers that come from reckless charges. They come from a doctrine built around firepower patience and refusing to expose men unnecessarily. And that doctrine had a name at the top of it. Major General Andrew D. Bruce. Bruce was 49 years old when he took command. A career artillery officer, not an infantry romantic. He believed in mathematics and trajectories, not slogans. He believed that courage without firepower was wasteful. That maneuver without support was suicide. He trained the division accordingly. Emphasize fire discipline, avoid frontal assaults, go around strong points instead of through them, let artillery and heavy weapons do the killing. Infantry exists to occupy ground, not to die proving bravery. I have always found Bruce interesting because nothing about his approach feels flashy. It feels cold, almost bureaucratic, and yet it produced results that shocked even other American commanders. The 77th did not fight harder than everyone else. They fought smarter, and they accepted being called slow or cautious if it meant their casualty list stayed shorter. Guam proved it first. When the division landed in July 1944, expectations were low. The initial resistance was light, then the real defences appeared. Caves, jungle fortifications, machine guns buried into rock. Where younger units might have rushed the old bastard surrounded positions, waited, shelled them into silence, and then moved in. Guam fell by August 8th. The division's casualty ratio stunned observers. The method worked. Leyte would be worse. Everyone knew it. When the division was diverted from rest and refit and sent straight back into combat, there was no grand speech about glory. There was only preparation, maps, timetables, fire plans. When Bruce ordered the amphibious landing south of Ormoc on December 7th, it was not bold for the sake of boldness. It was calculated. 3.5 miles from the town, unexpected, disruptive, and fast. Within 72 hours, the division had advanced 23 miles and taken Ormoc. That speed was not youth. It was planning. It was not courage. It was coordination. By the time Japanese ships approached the bay on the night of December 11th, the men on shore were not exhausted amateurs reacting emotionally. They were veterans who had already learned one lesson over and over. If you let the enemy dictate the terms, you pay for it in blood. This is where the personality of the division matters. A younger unit might have waited for the Navy, might have hesitated, might have worried about doing something outside doctrine. The old bastards did not have that instinct. They had already broken the manual on Guam, already bent it on Leyte. For them, the manual was a reference, not a rule. I will say this plainly. The night at Ormoc did not happen because someone was brave enough to try something crazy. It happened because an older methodical division saw a problem ran the numbers and decided the risk of action was lower than the risk of waiting. That mindset, more than any single weapon, is what made the next 18 minutes possible. At 11:55 p.m. on December 11th, 1944, the men along the Ormoc waterfront were already in position. No shouting, no last-minute scrambling. The orders had gone out 20 minutes earlier, and nothing had changed since. Track the vessels, wait for illumination, fire on command. The bay in front of them was black, flat and silent, broken only by the slow movement of dark shapes against darker water. 3 ships at first, then more behind them, 5 in total. Transports and barges heavy with men, heavy with equipment, moving slowly because shallow water does not forgive speed. No one on shore knew for certain if this would work. The M10 tank destroyers had been brought to Leyte to kill German-style armour that did not exist in the Philippines. Their 3-inch guns had never been fired at ships. Nobody had tested penetration against hull plating. Nobody had a table for deflection on waterborne targets. If the Japanese opened fire, the M10s were open-topped, vulnerable, exposed. This was not bravery. It was controlled uncertainty, and it was deliberate. At exactly 12 a.m., the first illumination round left its tube. A 60mm mortar shell climbed into the sky, arced out over the bay, and burst 300 feet above the water. White light flooded everything. Ormoc Bay stopped being a shadow and became a diagram. Distances snapped into clarity, angles sharpened. The lead vessel appeared in perfect silhouette, already beached northwest of the town ramps, down troops moving. This is the moment when the entire engagement pivoted. The Japanese transport, later identified as number 159, was approximately 200 feet long, about 800 tons displacement hull plating, less than 1 inch thick. It was designed to carry men not survive gunfire. The M10 crews had 30 seconds before the flare burned out. 30 seconds to range, aim, load and fire. The first 3-inch armour-piercing round left the barrel at roughly 2,600 feet per second. Range to target 970 yards, time of flight just over 1 second. The recoil shoved the 17-ton vehicle backwards 6 inches into the sand. The shell struck the transport on the starboard side just above the waterline. There was no dramatic explosion, just penetration. The round punched through the hull, passed through the cargo space and detonated against the port bulkhead. Inside the ship, the effect was immediate and catastrophic. A hole the size of a truck opened in the hull. Water began pouring in at an estimated rate of 2,000 gallons per minute. The vessel listed 7 degrees almost instantly. Japanese troops froze on the ramps. Those still inside surged toward the exits. Equipment rolled loose. The ship was no longer a transport. It was a sinking container. 40 seconds later, the second illumination round went up. The bay lit again. Transport number 159 was settling deeper now, stern down waterline rising. American artillery began ranging in. The M10 that had fired the first shot fired again. This time the round struck below the waterline after opening a second breach. Flooding exceeded any pumping capacity the crew had. The ship was finished, but the engagement did not pause to acknowledge that. 4 more Japanese vessels were still coming. The second transport was 600 yards out when all guns were cleared to fire. 40mm anti-aircraft guns normally reserved for aircraft began hammering surface targets, each gun capable of 120 rounds per minute. Self-propelled howitzers lobbed 105mm high explosive shells not to penetrate, but to tear superstructures apart through blast and fragmentation. Machine guns raked barges. The M10s reloaded calmly, tracking movement, adjusting elevation. The second transport took a 3-inch round through the bow. The shell detonated among packed troops, killing an estimated 40 men instantly. The captain did not turn away. Japanese discipline held. He pushed forward until a 105mm shell split the hull open at the waterline. The ship ran aground 400 yards from shore, too deep for troops to wade, too shallow to float free. Men jumped into water over their heads. Many drowned before they could even try to swim. American machine guns found the rest. Transport number 159 was fully submerged by 12:20 a.m. Only the superstructure remained visible. The 3 barges fared worse. One disintegrated under concentrated 40mm fire in 12 seconds. Another tried to turn away and was cut in half by a single 3-inch round. The last made it to 70 yards from shore, grounded in 3 feet of water, and unloaded 50 men directly into interlocking fields of fire. None reached the beach. From first flare to last shot, 18 minutes passed. 5 Japanese vessels destroyed, approximately 750 enemy troops killed, American casualties 0. I want to be very clear here. This was not chaos. This was not panic fire. This was synchronized layered destruction executed exactly as planned. That is what makes it unsettling. There is no hero moment to point at, no single man to elevate, just a system doing exactly what it was designed to do even if the target was never supposed to be there. When the firing stopped, the bay went dark again. The men on shore did not cheer. They did not celebrate. They reloaded. They waited. Because everyone understood one thing. If the Japanese had tried once, they would try again. What happened at Ormoc was not luck, and it was not improvisation in the romantic sense. It was physics doing exactly what physics always does when steel meets thinner steel at speed. The M10 tank destroyer had never been designed to sink ships, but it had been designed to do something far more demanding. Punch holes through armour that fights back. And on the night of December 11th, the targets waiting in the bay were not armoured at all. The 3-inch gun mounted on the M10 fired an armour-piercing round weighing just over 15 pounds. Muzzle velocity was approximately 2,600 feet per second. At 1,000 yards, that round could penetrate roughly 3 inches of rolled homogeneous steel. That mattered in Europe, where German tanks were built to survive hits. In Ormoc Bay, it mattered for a very different reason. Japanese transport vessels were built to carry men and supplies, not to absorb fire. Their hull plating was often less than 1 inch thick, sometimes far less. Against that, the M10 was not overkill, it was surgical. The key was where the crews aimed. Not at superstructures, not at decks, not at anything dramatic. They aimed at the waterline, below it when possible. Because a ship does not need to explode to die. It only needs to lose the battle against water. Once flooding begins faster than pumps can compensate, the outcome is mathematically fixed. Gravity takes over. Buoyancy fails. Everything else is detail. I want to stress this because it changes how you see the engagement. The M10 crews were not trying to sink ships the way naval gunners think about sinking ships. They were not seeking magazine detonations or catastrophic blasts. They were opening holes. 2 holes were enough, sometimes 1. At Ormoc, the first transport began taking on water at an estimated rate of 2,000 gallons per minute after the initial hit. That number alone seals its fate. No damage control team on a lightly built transport can outrun that. This is where the open-topped design of the M10 becomes ironic. It was a liability against artillery and aircraft, but it gave the crews excellent visibility. They could see the silhouettes clearly under illumination. They could track movement. They could adjust aim in real time. They were not firing blind. They were firing deliberately correcting after each shot as the ships listed and settled. That is why follow-up rounds went lower, not higher. They were not guessing. They were watching the effect and finishing the job. I remember thinking when I first understood this that it sounded almost cold. There is nothing heroic about aiming lower to drown a ship faster, but war is not impressed by drama. It rewards efficiency. And the 77th Infantry Division had already learned that lesson on Guam and across Leyte. This was simply that lesson applied to a new target. The other weapons mattered too, but in supporting roles. The 105mm howitzers did not sink ships by themselves. Their shells were not designed for penetration. What they did was strip superstructures, kill exposed troops, collapse decks, and create chaos. 40mm anti-aircraft guns firing explosive rounds shredded wooden barges and exposed hull sections. Machine guns finished what the water started. None of these systems alone explains the outcome. Together, they made survival impossible. What is important is what did not matter. The Japanese ships did not have meaningful armour. They did not have effective counterfire for shore-based guns. They were constrained by shallow water, forced to move slowly, unable to manoeuvre sharply without grounding. Once committed, they could not disengage quickly. In naval terms, they were already dead the moment they crossed into the bay. They just had not realised it yet. This is why the War Department's later investigation focused so heavily on physical evidence. They were not trying to assign credit. They were trying to answer a technical question. Could a tank destroyer actually do this? The answer, once divers measured the hulls and metallurgists examined shell fragments, was yes. Not theoretically, practically, reproducibly, under the right conditions. That realization mattered more than the sinking itself, because it meant this was not a fluke. It was a capability that simply had never been needed before, or never been recognized. The manual for the M10 would later be updated with a short section on engaging naval targets. 3 paragraphs, clinical, detached. It noted effective range, recommended aiming points, cited Ormoc Bay as the reference case. I find that detail telling. 3 paragraphs. No fanfare, no medals. Just an acknowledgement that reality had forced a correction. War had revealed something the designers had not bothered to imagine, and once you see it this way, the engagement at Ormoc stops feeling miraculous and starts feeling inevitable. Thin steel, high velocity, water, time. The outcome was decided the moment the first round struck at the right height. Everything after that was momentum. What truly changed the course of events was not that ships were sunk, but that the Japanese command understood the implication immediately. Ormoc was no longer just dangerous. It was lethal in a way that could not be countered without changing the entire approach. That understanding would shape what happened next. The Japanese tried again the very next night. December the 12th, 1944, just after 10 p.m. 2 barges approached Ormoc Bay from the north, smaller silhouettes this time lower in the water, faster built to slip through gaps. The logic was simple. If big transports died, try something smaller. If speed failed, try darkness. If darkness failed, try again anyway. The Americans did not need a meeting to respond. Illumination went up at 800 yards. The M10s were already laid in. Both barges were destroyed before they crossed 500 yards. Estimated Japanese casualties 100. American casualties 0. The math had not changed overnight. The third night was the test. December 13th. The Japanese escalated. One larger transport, possibly 900 tons displacement, carrying an estimated 400 troops and heavy equipment escorted by 3 barges. This was not stubbornness. This was confirmation. Japanese command needed to know whether Ormoc was still usable, whether the losses of the 11th had been an anomaly, whether there was still a window. The answer came quickly. The transport was hit, then hit again. High explosive tore open the superstructure. A 3-inch round punched through the hull. Flooding followed the same pattern as before. The ship sank in 12 minutes. The escort barges never made it inside 1,000 yards. Estimated Japanese casualties that night 550. American casualties 0. At this point, the story stops being about tactics and starts being about decision-making under pressure. In 3 nights, Japanese command lost approximately 1,300 troops trying to reinforce Ormoc. Not in drawn-out ground combat, not over weeks, in minutes. Every attempt followed the same script and ended the same way. Ships destroyed before unloading, survivors trapped in the water, no ability to adapt without losing even more men. I want to underline this because it explains what happened next. The Japanese did not stop because they were surprised. They stopped because the numbers no longer made sense. Yamashita was ruthless, but he was not irrational. He could accept losses if they bought time. What Ormoc now offered was loss without gain. No troops ashore, no supplies delivered, no delay achieved. Just dead men and sunken hulls. So after December 13th, the convoy stopped. Ormoc Bay was written off. Not officially announced, not ceremonially abandoned. It simply went quiet. No more barges probing the darkness. No more transports creeping toward the beach. The funnel closed. The effect inland was immediate and devastating. Japanese forces in the mountains west of Ormoc had been surviving on a thin logistical thread. Rice ammunition, medical supplies, replacements, all of it depended on those nighttime landings. Once they stopped, the clock started ticking. Units ran low on ammunition first, then food, then morale. Wounded men stopped being evacuated. Commanders stopped receiving orders. The battlefield did not explode. It withered. The 77th Infantry Division advanced north from Ormoc on December 14th. The 307th Infantry Regiment led. They met resistance, but it was different now. Positions were held longer than they should have been, then abandoned suddenly. Artillery fire became sporadic. Counterattacks lost coordination. By Christmas Day, Leyte was effectively secure. The official campaign statistics tell part of the story. 19,456 Japanese soldiers killed on Leyte by the 77th, 124 captured. American losses 543 killed, 1,469 wounded, a kill ratio of 36-1. What those numbers do not include are the ships, the men who never reached shore, the units that never formed because their replacements went to the bottom of Ormoc Bay. That omission matters, because it hides the speed of collapse. Without Ormoc, the Japanese 35th Army was not defeated by a single decisive battle. It was starved out, cut off, reduced piece by piece. This is why the night of December 11th mattered far beyond the bay itself. It was not dramatic in the way Midway was dramatic. There was no grand fleet action, no famous admirals, no iconic photographs, but strategically it slammed a door that could not be reopened. Every mile the Americans advanced after that was cheaper in blood than it would have been a week earlier. Every Japanese position that fell did so without hope of reinforcement. I find this part uncomfortable because it forces an honest conclusion. The destruction of those ships did not just win a firefight. It removed options, and in war removing options is often more decisive than destroying forces. Once Ormoc was sealed, Leyte's outcome was no longer in doubt. The only remaining question was how long it would take for the consequences to reach every foxhole in the mountains, and they did. In January of 1945, the United States Army did something it almost never did in the middle of an ongoing war. It questioned its own report. Not because the outcome was politically inconvenient, not because someone complained, but because the numbers did not fit the model. An infantry division had reported sinking multiple enemy vessels using tank destroyers. That was not a claim you simply filed and moved on from. If it was wrong, it needed correction. If it was right, it meant the army had just discovered a capability it did not know it had. So an investigation team was sent to Ormoc Bay. By then, the fighting had moved on, the beaches were quiet, the water was shallow and clear at low tide. Divers went down and found transport number 159 resting in roughly 15 feet of water. The hull was intact enough to examine. They measured the holes. 2 clean entry points on the starboard side, both approximately 3 inches in diameter, both below the waterline. The spacing matched the firing reports. The angles matched the shoreline positions of the M10 guns. There was no ambiguity here. Steel records truth better than memory ever will. The second transport lay in deeper water. Navy divers reached it as well. They found 3 penetrations, 2 consistent with 3-inch armor-piercing rounds, 1 consistent with a 105mm high explosive shell. Fragments were recovered from the seabed. Metallurgical analysis traced them to armor-piercing rounds manufactured in 1944 at the Waterline Arsenal in New York. There was no room left for doubt. The after-action reports were accurate, the timeline was accurate, the results were real. The conclusion was simple and unsettling. The 77th Infantry Division had in fact sunk enemy vessels using armoured fighting vehicles firing from shore positions. This was the only confirmed instance of its kind in the Second World War. Not in the Pacific, not in Europe, not anywhere. Tanks had never sunk ships before. They would never do it again. I want to pause here because this is where most stories would end with celebration. Medals, headlines. Men pulled aside for interviews. None of that happened. No special commendations were issued for sinking ships. The action was categorized as part of the normal defense of Ormoc. The M10 crews returned to their primary role, destroying fortifications, supporting infantry, preparing for Okinawa. The moment passed without ceremony. General Andrew Bruce mentioned the engagement exactly once in his memoirs, 1 sentence. He wrote that the division had demonstrated unusual flexibility in employing all available weapons against enemy forces regardless of whether those weapons were designed for the task. That was it. No flourish, no emphasis. For him it was simply confirmation that his philosophy worked. The army did make one quiet change. In March of 1945, the technical manual for the M10 tank destroyer was updated. A new section was added. Employment against naval targets. 3 paragraphs long. It noted that 3-inch armor-piercing rounds could penetrate unarmored vessels at ranges up to 1,000 yards. It recommended aiming at the waterline to maximize flooding, and it cited Ormoc Bay as the reference case. The update was clinical, almost indifferent. As if the army was acknowledging a footnote rather than a historical anomaly, and then the opportunity vanished. The Japanese never attempted another large-scale amphibious reinforcement under American shore guns. The war moved on to Iwo Jima, then Okinawa, where defenders were already in place. There were no more Ormocs, no more moments where ships crept toward beaches under improvised coastal fire. The lesson existed, but the battlefield never asked for it again. The men who fired those 15 rounds went on with their war. They fought on Okinawa, they lost friends, they survived. Most never spoke publicly about sinking ships. To them it was just another night where the job had to be done. One of the last surviving crew members died in 2003. His family did not know the story until they read his service records. Bronze Star, Purple Heart, campaign ribbons, a citation that mentioned engaging enemy naval vessels with tank destroyer fire. That was all. This is where I want to put the question directly to you. If you believe this night at Ormoc Bay is the clearest example of American ingenuity under fire, where ordinary soldiers used whatever they had to shut down an entire enemy strategy, comment the number 7 right now. If you disagree, if you think this was just circumstance or exaggeration, or not as important as it sounds like this video instead, either way, make a choice. Don't sit in the middle. And if you want more stories like this, stories pulled from after-action reports and forgotten documents, not polished myths, subscribe to the channel. These moments do not survive unless someone keeps telling them. Because Ormoc Bay still looks unimportant on a map. The water is calm. The wrecks are buried under silt. But for 18 minutes in December of 1944, that bay decided the fate of an entire campaign. And it did it in a way that has never been repeated.